Well, let's move on to another issue, completely different, but one I know that you're pretty fired up about. Back in 2018, Professor Peter Ridd appeared on Jones and Credlin, along with Alan Jones, me. He made comments then about the quality of scientific research in relation to the Great Barrier Reef, and he ended up with his employer, James Cooke University, terminating his position. They argued he breached standards at the university. He argued that as a scientist, his job was to be critical if he felt research needed to be challenged. He made a claim of unfair dismissal in the federal court and he won. It was seen, wasn't it, as a real win for academic freedom and free speech on our university campuses until last week when the university's appeal was upheld. But not one to take the issue lying down. He's now taken the fight for free speech all the way to the High Court, and Professor Ridd joins me now from Innisfail in Queensland. Well, I tell you what, you're a brave man. It's no easy feat to take a case to the High Court, Peter Ridd. It's expensive, time-consuming, high risk, the whole kit and caboodle. Why are you so determined to push ahead?
Well, there's a lot of principles here. I mean the principle of academic freedom, but also that scientists really do need to talk about things like the Great Barrier Reef, where there's legislation that's affecting every farmer in North Queensland at the moment, in my view, based on science which is not properly quality assured, which, if you remember, was the thing that got me into trouble. It was actually a question that you asked me, Peter, in fact, and I'm really glad you asked that question because it had to be asked and I had to answer it that way because it was what I believe was the truth.
I am devastated to hear you say that I'm the one that's got you in this bother, but you know, isn't the job of an academic, and hasn't this been the story of science through the ages, to test and to question and to push boundaries and not accept the status quo? I mean, if we accept the status quo, we'd all say the world was flat. How could you get in trouble for doing the very job of a scientist?
Well, firstly, don't feel devastated at all because sooner or later it was going to happen. And because I needed to say that, I'd just written that paper, in fact, if you remember, about the quality assurance problems in science. And so that's what we were there to talk about, and that was my work, and I've got plenty of justification for that. And you're right, if scientists are not allowed to challenge things like that, then you don't progress. In my case, I'm saying there's systemic problems with the quality assurance of the science, and I've given lots of examples of that. And in fact, even since I was fired, one of the organisations which I was talking about, the JCU's Coral Reef Centre, they were audited by a group of 7 international scientists on 8 major studies, and that group found all 8 of their studies were 100% wrong. So, you know, this proved what I said, that there was a quality assurance problem at that institution.
You probably read Professor Greg Craven in The Australian this week. For those who don't know Greg Craven, he's the Vice-Chancellor of the Australian Catholic University. He said that universities typically have 2 issues with academic freedom, and he's a big proponent of academic freedom. He says first, when it upsets a stakeholder, and here we're talking about a corporate sponsor, or he used the example of a government or China. And secondly, when the opinion runs counter to the accepted wisdom, which is your crime. Would I be correct to say that your views on climate change were not only academic heresy at JCU, but you perhaps threatened some grant funding? Was that the real issue, do you think?
Well, I never like to use the argument, these scientists are just doing it for money. You know, that might be the situation with some of the administrators, but the scientists who I disagree with, in virtually every case, they believe what they're saying. I just think that they've got it wrong. I think in the case of the Great Barrier Reef, they're often emotional. By the way, that was another comment that got me into trouble because I think they are, and you can understand why. If you've worked on the Great Barrier Reef, it's a beautiful thing, and they worry about it like a mother worries about a child. And that's a problem because they are actually emotional attached to it.
Dan Tehan, he's the Federal Education Minister. He's looking at a code to protect freedom of speech on the campus. You know the pressures on academics better than anyone else. Is it possible that it can be protected with a code? And if it can, what would you want to see in the code?
The code that has come by ex-Chief High Court Judge Robert French is actually quite a good code. It basically says you can't introduced this code of conduct, which basically means you've got to be collegial, whatever that means, and you've got to show respect, whatever that means. The university will decide. The problem with what Minister Tehan was originally proposing was it was going to be voluntary and external to the university, whereas in my view, it has to be written into the work contracts. So there's absolutely no doubt. The problem for an academic is that if you're going to say something controversial, you need to be sure you're away from the cliff edge. If you have to be respectful, you're never sure, well, if I'd said untrustworthy, well, that got me into trouble, but maybe if I'd said unreliable, that wouldn't have got into trouble. You can't afford to be worrying about that.
It can't be language subjective at all. You're absolutely right. It must be in the employment contract and pretty clear at that. I'm conscious of time, but I'm also conscious that going to the High Court is not cheap. What's being done to support you in this fight? Because it's a fight that we all should share. Is there any way we can support you, raise funds? How can people at home help?
We've got a GoFundMe going. If you Google GoFundMe Peter Ridd, you can donate. Already a couple of thousand people have donated, and that was in the previous ones, and we're getting up there already. Thank you.
Well, if I can do anything to help, because I feel like now I've got you in the mess, you are very welcome on here anytime to talk about these and many other issues. But I will keep, I'll put it on my Facebook page and we'll promote that GoFundMe as well. Peter Ridd, good luck with your fight. You carry a lot of people on your shoulders. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Bye.